네, 먼저 바쁘신 일정 가운데에도 코로나19 시대에서의 세계 질서와 또 국제 협력 방안에 대해 논의하는 2020 서울 안보대화 화상 세미나에 함께해 주시는 모든 분들께 감사의 말씀 드립니다. 2020 서울 안보대화 화상 세미나는 오늘부터 사흘간 새로운 안보 도전, 연대와 협력을 통한 극복이라는 주제로 진행이 됩니다. First of all, we would like to express our deepest gratitude to all of you for taking the time to watch and participate the 2020 Seoul Defense Dialogue. It is now live streamed online, and this year it is held under the theme of Emerging Security Challenges, Overcoming Through Solidarity and Cooperation. From now on, let us start with the opening ceremony of the Seoul Defense Dialogue 2020. 네, 그러면 지금부터
We will now commence the opening ceremony of the Seoul Defense Dialogue 2020 virtual seminar. To start our dialogue, we would like to invite our host, who has provided us with his utmost support. We have Honorable Vice Minister Park Jae-min of the Ministry of National Defense of the Republic of Korea.
of National Defense of Korea will give us his welcoming remarks.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Republic of Korea Vice Minister of National Defense Park Jae-min. I would like to extend a sincere welcome to everyone participating in the 2020 Seoul Defense Dialogue virtual seminar. Let me begin by expressing my profound gratitude to all of those who have taken time out of their busy schedules to be with us today, including our on-site domestic panelists, our overseas panel members who will be sharing their valuable insights over video conference. The Seoul Defense Dialogue was launched in 2012 for the establishment of peace on the Korean Peninsula and multilateral security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region, and it has grown into a platform for international security exchange and cooperation with the participation from more than 50 nations and 800 individuals. However, this year, due to COVID-19, we have decided to utilize an online and offline hybrid virtual seminar. It is unfortunate that we are not able to host defense officials and security specialists here in person. But I believe it is a blessing that we're able to host this event, albeit virtually, even as so many international security conferences were canceled during the first half of the year. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is engaged in a bitter battle against COVID-19. We have already seen approximately 25 million confirmed cases across 218 countries, and an estimated 850,000 people have lost their lives. Moreover, political controversy over lockdowns and government responses has been unstable in many nations since the onset of the pandemic, and the rapid contraction of the global economy has prompted the OECD to forecast this year's annual growth rate to be negative 7.6%. Most of all, we have seen countless individuals experience the breakdown of their everyday routines. These wide-ranging political, economic, and social crises are not only critical security threats in themselves, but also place severe limitations on the military readiness postures of many nations. In this way, non-traditional security threats such as infectious diseases and artificial and natural disasters are infiltrating our lives at unexpected moments, and it is taking place very rapidly. We still have traditional security threats such as conflict over land and maritime jurisdictions, arms races, and rising military tensions. And at the same time, we have the rise of non-traditional security threats that are causing uncertainty in the global security environment. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many worries that within the grave security conditions we currently face, the mindset of every person and nation for themselves will work to erode international unity and multilateral cooperation. It is difficult to deny that this unprecedented crisis has led to a rise in anxiety and conflict. However, now is the time when solidarity and cooperation become even more instrumental than ever in overcoming this joint crisis. There are no boundaries when it comes to the safety and peace of humanity, and solidarity and cooperation are truly our greatest and only weapons if we are to claim victory in this war against COVID-19. In order to facilitate this solidarity and cooperation, the international community must not abandon its efforts for dialogue and communication. This is the reason why the Republic of Korea, the Ministry of National Defense, has decided to push through with this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue. Today is the first day of the 3-day SDD virtual seminar. This year, we're focusing on new security challenges overcoming through solidarity and cooperation. Today and tomorrow, a prominent group of experts will discuss the global order and international cooperation in the age of COVID-19 and non-traditional security threats. In addition, as this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, the third day will feature a session dedicated to the Korean Peninsula peace process and its achievements, outlook, and tasks. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that the Seoul Defense Dialogue 2020 will lead to prudent solutions for overcoming this crisis. I'd like to ask for your continued interest and support. Once again, my heartfelt thanks to everyone taking part in this seminar. As a parting sentiment, I leave you with my hopes that our dialogue today will become a foundation for solidarity and cooperation. Thank you.
차관님 뜻깊
Thank you very much, Vice Minister, for your meaningful opening remarks. Faced with unprecedented challenges, thank you for this gathering to help us find solutions. Next, we would like to provide you with a screening of the remarks by Honorable Minister Chung Kyung-do.
Korea has sent us a video message to congratulate the Seoul Defense Dialogue 2020. 영상으로 함께 만나보시겠습니다.
Please take a look at the screen.
클립.
안녕하십니까. 정경두 대한민국 국방부 장관입니다. 먼저 전 세계적인 코로나19 위기 상황에서도 2020 서울 안보대화 화상 세미나에 참여해 주신 세계 각국 정부와 국제기구 관계관 그리고 국내외 안보 전문가 여러분들께 감사드립니다. 여러분들께서도 잘 아시는 바와 같이 지금 세계는 전통적 군사위협과 사이버, 테러, 재해, 재난, 감염병 등 비전통적 안보 위협이 공존하고 있는 매우 복잡하고 예측 불가능한 상황에 직면하고 있습니다. 특히 올해 초부터 코로나19라는 감염병이 실질적인 위협으로 다가와 우리의 생명과 건강은 물론 세계의 정치, 외교, 경제, 안보에도 심대한 영향을 미치고 있습니다. 대한민국은 지난 2월 일일 수백 명에 달하는 확진자 발생으로 어려움을 겪었지만 선제적인 검역과 방역 조치, 경증 환자를 위한 생활치료센터 운용, IT 기술을 접목한 확진자의 신속한 동선 추적 등 이른바 K-방역의 대표적인 대응을 통해 이를 슬기롭게 극복하였고 이러한 노하우를 정부 차원에서 적극적으로 세계 각국과 공유하면서 코로나19 방역을 선도해 왔습니다. 국방부 차원에서도 코로나19의 국내 확산 차단과 범정부 대응 지원에 대한 설명 자료를 작성하여 39개국 주한 외국 무관단에 제공하는 한편 52개국 제외 한국 무관부를 통해 주재국과 공유하였습니다. 또한 합참의장과 육해 공군 총장들도 각국 군 지휘부와의 화상회의를 통해 고강도 방역 대책을 강구한 상태에서 훈련을 안전하고 효율적으로 실시하고 군사 대비태세를 유지할 수 있는 노하우를 전해주었습니다. 더불어 우리 정부는 6.25 전쟁 70주년을 맞이하여 22개국 유엔 참전국 참전용사님들의 희생과 공헌에 대한 감사의 마음으로 100만 장이 넘는 방역 마스크를 지원해 드리기도 하였습니다. 그러나 이러한 노력에도 불구하고 최근 전 세계적으로 2차 대유행이 우려되고 있어 그 어느 때보다도 국가 간 연대와 협력이 절실해지고 있습니다. 이러한 상황 속에서 열리는 이번 서울 안보 대화는 코로나19 등 국제사회가 직면하고 있는 비전통 안보 위협에 대한 대응 방안과 코로나19 이후 시대 국제협력 강화 방안 등을 폭넓게 논의할 수 있는 소중한 시간이 될 것이라고 확신합니다. 끝으로 대한민국 정부는 북한의 완전한 비핵화와 한반도의 항구적 평화 정착을 반드시 구현하겠다는 절실한 마음으로 남북관계 개선에 최선을 다하고 있습니다. 여러분들께서도 한반도의 평화를 만들어가는 우리 정부의 담대한 여정에 적극 동참해 주시고 변함없는 성원을 부탁드립니다. 다시 한번 코로나19 등 어려운 여건 속에서도 2020 서울 안보대화 화상 세미나에 참여해 주신 모든 분들께 감사드리며 여러분 모두의 건강과 행복을 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
네, 정경도 장
Thank you very much, Minister, for your remarks.
sending us your remarkable message. And now this marks the end of the opening ceremony and session 1 will begin shortly. 네, 그럼 이상으로 2020 서울 안보대화 화상 세미나의 개회식을 모두 마치겠습니다. 이어서 세션 1으로 바로 이어가도록 하겠습니다. Please stay with us for the following session 1.
Good morning, honorable Mr. Speakers and distinguished guests and audience out there. I would like to welcome you all to the Seoul Defense Dialogue 2020. My name is Jiyoon Kim, and I'm very honored to be moderating the first session of this virtual seminar. The coronavirus leaves us with many questions. Do we need to shut down the border, or do we need to enhance the international cooperation? And has geopolitics returned, and how will it affect to the global order and international security? And I think we have the most timely subject today in the first session, titled Global Order and International Cooperation in the Age of the COVID-19. So to answer all these questions, we have invited the most prominent scholars in Seoul, Singapore, and Chicago. Yes? So we have invited the most prominent scholars in security in Seoul, Singapore, Chicago, and in China, in Beijing. Let me first introduce our panelists. As a matter of fact, I do not really need to any further introduction. So before we begin, let me actually introduce the film that entails the theme of the seminar today. So we'll just run the film first, and then we'll continue.
A world no one had experienced. A world no one had imagined. We can overcome this crisis through solidarity and cooperation.
그동안 위기와 기회를 함께 나누어왔듯이 이번 코로나 위기도 함께 극복해 나가기 바랍니다.
Where are we headed? A dialogue for the future.
네, 이번 세션의 주제인 코로나
This session is titled Global Order and International Cooperation in the Age of COVID-19. Before we start the session, we would like to introduce how you may participate in the Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the session, please utilize the web browser. Please utilize the website on the screen for your questions and comments.
Please allow me to give you some information about the online Q&A system. If you get questions during the session, please submit yours to our online Q&A browser. Please kindly follow the guideline that appears on the screen and post your questions. Thank you. 이어서 자장님께서 이제
We will now turn the floor to our moderator.
Before we start, let me first introduce our panelists. As a matter of fact, I do not need to add any further introduction for them because they are all very well-known people, but I'm just going to do it anyway because that's what I'm paid for. We have excellent and the best panels today here in Seoul, Chicago, Singapore, and Beijing. It's very truly fascinating to moderate this session, and I'm really glad to with these people. First, we have Dr. Paik Haksoon. He is president of Sejong Institute, the think tank located in Seoul, Korea. He is also a very well-known scholar who has an expertise in unification, North Korea, and foreign policy. And we have Dr. Yoon, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Republic of Korea, and he is also now the Professor Emeritus of Political Science and International Relations at Seoul National University. And now, across the ocean and the continent, we have Dr. John J. Mearsheimer, anyone who has studied international relations and the realism, you should know it, of course, definitely. And he is a Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science of the University of Chicago. And now we have Dr. Kishore Mahbubani. He has served as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations and also held the position of President of the UN Security Council. Now he is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. And last but not least, we have Dr. Wang Jisu. He is the president of the Institute of International Strategic Studies in Beijing University in China. Unfortunately, he could not join us today for the live streaming discussion, but he sent messages in a video clip. So let me briefly introduce the proceedings. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to present like 5 minutes. And after all the presentation, we're going to have lively discussion to the subject that we conjured up beforehand. And also you can raise a question if you have questions as the announcer MC introduced. You can put the type your questions, then I'm going to forward that to the panels. Without further ado, let's start the session. Please present tech.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to congratulate the Ministry of National Defense of the Republic of Korea on hosting Seoul Defense Dialogue 2020, despite all kinds of difficulties in these trying times. I'm privileged to be part of this year's event. In dealing with this session's subject, global order and international cooperation in the age of COVID-19, I would like to ask 3 questions and answer them as best as I can in order to save time. And first, what are the characteristics or distinctive features of COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 world combined? And second, what are the challenges of emerging non-traditional security issues of our time? And third, what should our response be? In other words, how to strengthen international and global, regional and global security cooperation in dealing with emerging security issues of today and tomorrow. Regardless of whether the COVID-19 pandemic will be a game changer in international politics or not, we are living in an immensely changed world. I would characterize the COVID-19 and the post-COVID-19 pandemic world by the observations or concepts such as unprecedentedness in our lifetime, comprehensiveness in scope, borderlessness, unpreparedness on our part, transformation or paradigm shift in the history of civilization, deglobalization trend localization, rapidly shrinking economy, protectionism, decoupling, and the reshoring and the polarization of wealth to income within and among nations, coming of a post-capitalism focused on resilience rather than efficiency. The return of geopolitics, a return of the state sovereignty and nationalism, even vaccine nationalism, very unfortunately, ethnocentrism, racism, and even xenophobia, to our disappointment. And worse off, the loss of cooperative global leadership in combating COVID-19 pandemic. Then, what are the challenges of emerging security issues of our time? First of all, why is a cooperative global leadership lacking or lost in combating COVID-19 pandemic? As we all know, the fierce rivalry between the United States and China, two most powerful countries of the world, from cooperating with each other in combating this viral disease. I think international community, particularly the United States and China, are caught in the trap of a mentality or obsession, if you will, in which they deal with emerging non-traditional security issues in the context of traditional security thinking, the key component of which is the focus on geopolitical, geostrategic competition and rivalry. And noteworthy is the concurrent emergence or birth of the remarkable roles played by the middle power states like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand in combating this viral disease, and also the strong push toward multipolarity and multilateralism in dealing with all these kinds of emerging security issues. Finally, how to strengthen regional and global cooperation, security cooperation in dealing with present and future uncertainties and crises. First, we need to treat emerging non-traditional security issues as such in their own right. So educate the decision makers to get out of the mentality and calculation of traditional security thinking in dealing with all these new crises and threats. And second, debunk the myth that the so-called most advanced countries with most powerful military and economy will be most effective in dealing with all these emerging security issues. And third, promote pragmatic, not ideological or value-laden multilateralism for problem solving. Finally, we need to promote the virtues of solidarity and cooperation across regions and globe. Find comprehensive, integrative concept or model based on those virtues and values, and create a local, regional, and a global platform for maintaining information exchange so that we can increase resilience of our society and the world so that we can bounce forward, not bouncing back when we get out of this this pandemic. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, President Paik. We have emphasized the cooperation regionally and more globally, but I'm not really sure it's going on well. And also has importance of the middle pole countries, as a lot of actually the advanced countries are failing the trailing and fix the COVID-19. Now I'd like to turn the micro over to the Minister Yoon, please.
Thank you very much. As many pundits are talking about the decline of Pax Americana, I think the liberal international order based on superior U.S. power and U.S. leadership has been significantly weakened. Liberal international order grounded on such norms as democratic governance, open market, or multilateralism has been weakening seriously. And the order based on international cooperation is being replaced by free-for-all kind of disorder or go-it-alone kind of nationalism these days. We could witness this kind of behaviors of states when they confronted the challenge of COVID-19 pandemic. In my view, there were two fundamental causes for this weakening of the liberal international order and American global leadership. One is the domestic level cause, and the other is international level cause. First, domestic level. American voters have become more and more reluctant to shoulder the burden of the U.S. global leadership. Domestic political support for the U.S. leadership in upholding liberal international order has been weakened, mainly because of increasing inequality in economic and social fields and accompanying political discontents. For example, the U.S. democracy could not effectively deliver those unemployed workers in the Rust Belt from their difficulties in the era of globalization. It could not provide enough social safety net, job retraining, or education so that they could get jobs in other sectors to survive. This economic inequality was also linked to the social inequality, and both divided the American society significantly. Especially after the 2008 global financial crisis, the anger of those people who regarded they were neglected began to erupt. And this led to the election of Donald Trump as the US president in 2016, and we all know what occurred thereafter. On the other hand, internationally, there has been narrowing gap in power capabilities, in particular economic powers between the United States and China. As the result of rapid economic growth in the recent few decades, China became quite confident and began to expand their political and military influence all over the world. Especially after around 2008 global financial crisis, China's foreign policy has become much bolder, and their Belt and Road Initiative and expansion of military power are two typical examples. So the tension between the rising power and the existing power has been rising, And this tension turned into an open and extensive confrontation when the US policymakers decided that there was no more hope for a convergence between two countries' political economic systems and practices toward the direction of liberal democracy. And these fundamental changes in two different levels were linked to and reinforced each other through the network of global interdependence. For instance, American investment and trade in China could bring cheap manufacturing products into the United States, but it weakened manufacturing industrial base in the United States while strengthening it in China through transfer of capital and technology. This contributed to both widening income gap or economic inequality in the United States and narrowing power gap, especially economic power, between the United States and China. And this is why I think President Trump and his supporters try to shift their economic policy toward protectionism and deglobalization. I think the solution could be found from these causes, and I will talk about that later, probably.
Well, thank you, Minister Yoon. I think you had the fundamental questions that will the U.S. sustain its leadership in the global community and how to deal with this rising tensions between the United States and China. And I think we have the perfect panels waiting. Next, Dr. Mearsheimer. And so you are not such a believer of liberal international order anyway, are you? So I think you have answers to the points that Minister Yoon raised and also your own presentation. Please.
I'm assuming that you can. The subject of my talk today is the rise and fall of the liberal international order. And actually, my comments follow very clearly on the comments that the foreign minister just made. A number of his points are neatly fit with the argument I want to make. Basically, I'm arguing that the liberal international order is fundamentally flawed and
well, we have some connection problem, and in this case, we are going to replace with the clips that we recorded beforehand. So as soon as we got the connection then we'll continue with the real-time one. Okay.
The rise and fall of the liberal international order. And my basic argument is that the liberal international order is in deep trouble today, that the glacis plates that underpin it are shifting, and that it's basically history. It has no real future. Now, in the United States, when lots of people hear this line of argument, they tend to blame President Trump for what's happening. But I don't think that President Trump is principally responsible for what is going on with regard to the liberal international order. He certainly bears some responsibility, but there are more fundamental problems with that order. I want to make three basic arguments today. My first argument is that there are different kinds of international orders, and what kind of international order you get depends in good part on the balance of power that exists in the world. And my particular argument is that to get a liberal international order, you have to have a unipolar system, a system in which there is only one great power, and that unipole, or that sole great power, has to be a liberal state. This is, of course, exactly what you had at the end of the Cold War. And the reason that you need a unipolar system to have a liberal international order is because in a unipolar order, the most powerful state in the system doesn't have to worry about security competition, and it can pursue an ideological foreign policy. And that, of course, is what the United States has done since the Cold War ended in 1989. As the sole pole and as a liberal sole pole, it has gone to great lengths to develop this liberal international order. So that's my first argument. My second argument is that a lot of people argue that the liberal international order was founded after World War II. I think this is mistaken. I believe it was founded after the Cold War. I think that during the Cold War, we had a very thin international order that was not liberal. But the two main orders in the world that existed were bounded orders. They were more refined, more discreet. One was a communist order led by the Soviet Union, and the other was the Western-led order, which the United States was basically in charge of. So you had these two bounded orders that really dominated the landscape. And of course, what happens is when the Cold War ends, that Western order prevails, and that Western order morphs into a liberal international order. So that's my second argument. Now, my third argument is that this liberal international order, which first arises after the Cold War ends, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Now, what exactly am I saying? What I'm saying is that there were policies that were embedded in this order that were destined to fail, destined to wreck the order over time. Let me give you some examples. One of the main policies was spreading democracy all across the world. Sometimes this involved wars in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Other times it involved interfering in the politics of countries like Russia and China. The end result of this is that we ended up, we the United States, in disastrous wars in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and we ended up poisoning relations with the Russians and the Chinese. Another policy that we pursued was to promote open or porous borders, to promote immigration that had few bounds. This caused all sorts of problems because states have real reticent about allowing immigrants to come in unless they're really controlled. It runs into the nationalism problem. So the emphasis on open and porous borders was big trouble. And then the liberal international order placed a very high premium on international institutions. And the end result of that is that lots of states felt that they were losing their sovereignty, which is an element of nationalism that is terribly important to modern nation states. And if you look at Brexit, one of the principal reasons that the British voted to leave the European Union is they thought that what was going on in Brussels threatened their sovereignty. And then finally, you get these very aggressive economic policies, I would call it hyperglobalization, that go along with the liberal international order. And the end result of this hyperglobalization was the rise of China. In effect, this liberal international order, which required unipolarity, helped grow China to the point where it was not just a great power, but it was a great power that looked like it could rival the United States. And of course, with Vladimir Putin in Russia, you had a resurrection of Russian power. So as almost everybody says these days, we have moved from unipolarity to multipolarity. But as I said earlier in my talk, once you move from unipolarity, once you are either in a bipolar system or a multipolar system, you can no longer have a liberal international order. You end up with a realist order. So here we are in the year 2020. And when you compare where we are with where we were in 1990, a year after the Cold War ended, 30 years ago, what you see is that people are much more pessimistic about our future than they were back then when the liberal international order was getting started. And that is because that order has failed. and it has failed because it contains the seeds of its own destruction. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Mearsheimer. And now I'd like to hand the mic over to Singapore, President Mahbubani, please.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and especially with my old friend, John Mearsheimer. He and I have different views, but we get along very well. You've given me 5 minutes, and in 5 minutes, I want to explain the fundamental reason for the sense of global turbulence that we face today. And there are basically, to use a Maoist term, 3 global contradictions that explain the turbulence in the world. I'll mention 3, I cannot get into all 3, and I'll discuss the first one. The first one is the global contradiction between our global need to cooperate, especially to fight COVID-19. And I'm glad the previous speakers have all mentioned COVID-19. This is our global need to cooperate, and yet at the same time, we are seeing the biggest geopolitical contest break out between the United States and China. And all the other speakers have spoken about that too. But there's a contradiction there. The second contradiction is between the interests of the Western countries to promote stronger multilateral cooperation, especially to deal with COVID-19. And then the desire of the Western countries to preserve their power. Multilateralism restrains power. So if you want to promote multilateralism, you have to restrain your power. So that's a second contradiction. The third contradiction is between the tremendous opportunity that Asian countries have today to succeed and thrive economically. As I always say, the 21st century will be the Asian century. But just as we are reaching a moment of great opportunity in Asia, we're now seeing a contradictory force of rising geopolitical tensions between Asian countries. And Exhibit A, it's what's happening between China and India, where people lost their lives at the border. So these are the 3 global contradictions. Let me just quickly discuss the first one in the 2 or 3 minutes that I have left. And here, if there's one message that COVID-19 is sending us, and I want to emphasize this boat metaphor. Before you had globalization, before you had COVID-19, when you live in 193 separate countries, it was as though we were living in 193 separate boats, right? With captains and crews taking care of each boat and rules to make sure the boats didn't collide. That's the old world order. But today, as a result of globalization, the world has shrunk. And COVID-19 tells us the world has shrunk. And the 7.8 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. Now, if you are living on the same boat, and if a fire hits your boat, the stupidest thing you can do is argue about who started the fire. First, you put out the fire. Don't argue. But instead, today, and this is the contradiction, because of the US-China geopolitical contest, instead of US and China cooperating with each other to put out the fire of COVID-19, they're fighting each other. You can see the contradiction. And by the way, you know, if Winston Churchill were alive today, if FDR were alive today, they would actually remind us that in World War II, when the West decided that Hitler was enemy number 1, FDR and Churchill cooperated with Stalin a communist dictator to fight Hitler, right? The United States has cooperated with communist countries when there's a common enemy. So logically speaking, what United States and China should be doing is to set aside their differences and say COVID-19 is my enemy, COVID-19 is your enemy, let us work together, kill COVID-19, destroy it. Because 7.8 billion people are affected by it. But even this temporary cooperation, which is logical, reasonable, cannot happen. Why? Because of the US-China geopolitical contest. And that's what my book, Has China Won, is about. And I put it behind my shoulder so you can see that this geopolitical contest is driven by deep structural forces. By the Thucydides trap that Graham Allison speaks about, by the fear of the yellow peril, which is real, and the disappointment in America that China hasn't become a democracy. There are deep structural forces at play. So I hope what I've done in my brief 5-minute opening remarks is to just give you a flavor of the deep structural forces that are causing this tremendous global turbulence today. And we have to address each of these global contradictions if we want to create a more peaceful world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, President Mahbubani. It's always fascinating to have panels in the same session with two different ideas. So I'm very much look forward to the discussion later. And next we have Professor Wang Jisu. As I said in the beginning of the session, he unfortunately cannot join us in the live streaming session. So he sent a message in a clip because he had to put all his ideas and thoughts in the one clip, so it can be a little bit longer than 5 minutes. Please, Dr. Wang Jisu.
I apologize for not being able to participate in the video conference on the spot due to an official engagement in Beijing on September 1st. Instead, I'm sending this video recording to present my views. I have seen 6 features in global politics today, and I think these features will continue to be unfolded after the pandemic crisis fades away. First, an inevitable consequence of globalization is the exacerbation of socioeconomic inequalities worldwide, between nation states, within ethnic groups, and within societies. The Gini coefficient has gone up in almost every society in the world. Economic growth promoted by new technologies and faster interflow of information has benefited the haves much more than the have-nots. The coronavirus pandemic hits the have-nots much harder than the haves. Second, worsening socioeconomic inequalities give rise to populism, as witnessed by vividly in the United States and European countries. In multi-ethnic societies like the United States, populism is reinforced by a form of nationalism that tends to blame other countries for its own failures. Populist nationalism will be a long-term feature in world politics and results in political divisions and polarization within countries as well as tensions between nations. Third, socioeconomic inequalities and populist nationalism tend to breed strongman politics and authoritarianism, which have already been seen manifested in a number of nations like Russia, Turkey, India, and Egypt. Western-style democracies and efforts to emulate them have either failed or met with insurmountable obstacles in many developing countries in the post-Cold War era. Western democracies themselves also have to readjust their systems to deal with the tide of immigration and economic protectionism. The fight against the coronavirus calls for resolute government measures like social distancing, wearing masks, and lockdown of public facilities. Such decisions tend to favor more powerful political authorities and government systems around the world. The efficiency of the Chinese government and the deficiency of US federal government in coping with the pandemic has served as a good comparison. Fourth, technological advancement is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, information technology, artificial intelligence, and other technological innovations give better quality to human life. On the other hand, the new technologies are easily used by governments, political organizations, and demagogues to brainwash people, instigate radical and nationalistic sentiments, and restrict individual freedom. The new technologies will also enlarge the gap between the rich and the poor, and build up social and psychological wars between groups of different identity. In international politics, technological warfare such as cyber war, space war, and biochemical warfare is and will remain more likely to happen than a conventional war or a nuclear war. Fifth, geostrategic competition are intensified. Geostrategic competitions will likely to be more intense in the post-COVID-19 period between China and India over the South China Sea, among Iran, Turkey, Arab countries, and Israel, and on the Korean Peninsula. In particular, geopolitical and geostrategic rivalry between China and the United States may well become a new normal in global politics in the future. Sixth, global political and economic order will be bifurcated. It is possible that the China-US strategic competition will force other countries to choose sides between them. Both Beijing and Washington now see the world from a black and white prism. In Beijing's eyes, a struggle between developing countries and developed countries. And in Washington's eyes, a division between democracies and non-democracies. Both China and the United States, no matter who wins the elections in November 2020, are determined to mobilize their respective global resources in their long-term strategic contention. To this extent, the world has moved into a period of bifurcation that in many ways reminds us of the Cold War. The features I described above have significant bearings for security and international relations in Northeast Asia. I can identify 4 security challenges on the road ahead. First, Pyongyang is faced with less pressure from the international community to terminate its nuclear and missile programs. North Korea will try to show more political solidarity with China based on their ideological affinity. Beijing sees no reason to coordinate with Washington to undermine the authorities of the DPRK. Pyongyang now has more breathing space and time to consolidate its domestic order and is likely to be more assertive towards the US ROK alliance. It will also try to drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington. Second, faced with increased tensions between China and the US, Seoul will try to keep a delicate balance between serving as a political and military ally of the US and as an economic partner of China. South Korea may face pressure from the US to join the so-called democratic camp, though the current leadership in Seoul will be reluctant to be drawn into such an anti-China orbit. China's leading diplomat, Mr. Yang Jiechi, visited South Korea a few days ago. Seoul may be hoping that President Xi Jinping's planned visit to Seoul in the near future will give a significant boost to its push for reconciliation with North Korea and fully restore bilateral economic cooperation with Beijing, which was damaged by China's reaction to South Korea's 2016 decision to allow the U.S. to deploy an advanced missile defense system on its soil. Third, the rising nationalisms in both Japan and South Korea make it difficult to improve their bilateral ties. That adds more obstacles to the construction of a China, South Korea, Japan free trade zone and a broader architecture of regional cooperation. Fourth, the general peace and stability in East Asia and the Western Pacific have been endangered to an unprecedented degree since the end of the Cold War. The emerging arms race between China and the US and their preparations for military showdown over the Taiwan Strait may likely bring about increased defense expenditures of regional actors. In my personal observation, Beijing has not dramatically changed its policy toward Taiwan based on the hope for peaceful unification and one country, two systems. Despite the increasingly aggressive forces in Taiwan resisting integration with the Chinese mainland. However, saber-rattling voices in China, stimulating nationalistic feelings and asking for military solution to the Taiwan issue, are gaining more momentum. They are a natural response to closer ties between Taiwan and the United States. The pro-Taiwan, anti-China military, the pro-Taiwan, anti-China political wing in Washington is more provocative than any time before. In addition, the maritime disputes in the South China Sea might trigger an accident between the military forces of China and the United States. I therefore offer four thoughts aimed at reduction of tensions and strengthening regional and international security cooperation. First, China, the United States, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and the international community at large should never give up efforts to build up a non-nuclear Korean peninsula. Meanwhile, we have to recognize the fact that Pyongyang will not abandon its nuclear weapons in any foreseeable future. Second, sanctions of the DPRK could do little to force it to change its nuclear posture. Instead, more should be done to encourage North Korea to open up and conduct domestic reforms. A year ago, in August 2019, I paid a short personal visit to Pyongyang and saw a cleaner and more orderly city. People there told me that their life had been improved since 2012 when Mr. Kim Jong-un succeeded the top leadership. This was encouraging news to me. The North Korean people are industrious and hardworking. Given right opportunities, they will build up a promising country. Third, we should continue efforts to stabilize China, South Korea, Japan. We should continue efforts to establish a China, South Korea, Japan free trade zone. Furthermore, the three countries should enhance regional cooperation to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and cope with other non-traditional security issues like climate change. Finally, regional actors should strengthen mechanisms for crisis management and crisis prevention. This is not only pertinent to China and the United States over the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, but also to other regional actors, including the ROK, the DPRK, and Japan. Thank you for listening to me, and my best wishes for successful Seoul Defense Dialogue 2020 special seminar. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Professor Wang. And now I'd like to turn to the session for the discussion. And before we start, I'd like to ask all out of our panels abroad to make sure that you are on the earphone so that we can hear you better. Well, the question I would like to ask first is this. I think everybody agree with that there's a tremendous changes happening and occurring in the world because of coronavirus, or maybe the change has been arriving beforehand. Excuse me. Well, Dr. Paik said that it's going to be a game changer, and even the Thomas Friedman said that before Corona and after Corona, and also Minister Yoon paid attention to the changes and uprisings within the U.S. and domestic politics that may affect international politics and cooperation as well. And also, the Mearsheimer, Dr. Mearsheimer emphasized that it's a totally different world. I mean, you cannot really expect the same thing for the past 30 years. And Dr. Mahbubani raised the, you always have been arguing that we are going to have the rising power of Asia. But so my question is, after the COVID-19, I'm not really sure if it's going to go away or not, but after COVID-19, so what will the world look like? I can see that it's going to be very different from the world we used to live in. But what do you expect? What's going to be the world look like? And should we expect a new global order, which is different from now we are having or we've been living in? So please, President Mahbubani, can you start?
Thank you. I would like to give you an optimistic answer that says that we, humanity, who in theory are supposed to be the most intelligent species on planet Earth, that we would learn the metaphysical lesson from COVID-19. And the metaphysical lesson from COVID-19 is that, as I said, all 7.8 billion people are now living in 193 cabins on the same boat. So the first thing we should do is take care of our boat before we take care of our cabins, because if the boat sinks, all 193 cabins also sink. That's so obvious. It's so obvious that we need to come together and cooperate against COVID-19. And I'm actually quite shocked, literally shocked, that the world doesn't understand something as basic and as simple as this. And so it is to me a sign that our minds are still set in the 19th century, 20th century, focus on issues like sovereignty, as though sovereignty was the most important issue today. It's not. It's about being on the same boat globally. And the good news, if I want to balance this bad news that we are not coming together to deal with a common challenge, the good news is that we don't have to reinvent the world to deal with these problems. One of the biggest gifts that the United States and Europe gave to the world was the 1945 rules-based order. And the principles of the 1945 rules-based order are still valid today. We can use those principles to cooperate with one another. We can use those institutions to cooperate with one another. So, for example, the World Health Organization is an organization that we should be strengthening. And instead, as you know, United States has left the World Health Organization And if you know, I've also said that unfortunately the West has been weakening the World Health Organization by cutting down the compulsory contributions to World Health Organization from 62% to 18%. Now that's an unnecessary weakening of the World Health Organization. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel to deal with these problems. Let us revive and resuscitate the 1945 rules-based order, and that will provide a basis for us to collaborate against COVID-19. And I hope that that is what will happen as a result of COVID-19, but sadly, I can tell you, I'm not optimistic. In the next 10 years, as I forecast in my book, Has China Won?, the geopolitical contest between US and China will override the need to collaborate against COVID-19 and other global challenges. So I'm sorry to be pessimistic.
Okay, I thought you were an optimistic person, but he's a pessimist. The rules has changed, but the Europe and the US is locked in the post-1945 rules-based order. I actually would like to listen to the answer from Professor Mearsheimer, but connection is not really good, so I'd like to turn to the mic over to Minister Yoon first.
Yes, I think the post-COVID-19 world will be characterized by very severe and extensive competition between the United States and China. It is a kind of beginning of a new Cold War. Many people are describing coming world like that, and I somewhat tend to agree with that view. Of course, one difference is that this time, two biggest powers, the United States and China, are interdependent heavily with each other. But I mean, severe competition will go on in all fronts: diplomatic, military, economic, even in the ideological front. For example, recently the ideological confrontation between the United States and China, between the Western liberal model and the Chinese authoritarian model, stiffened confrontation between two big powers much. So it is unfortunate. And this will lead to the lack of international leadership or vacuum, international leadership vacuum. And the first sacrifice will be, the first casualty of this will be international institutions. I mean, Dr. Mahbubani already emphasized the importance of liberal institutions, which was created after the end of World War II. But I think, unfortunately nowadays, these institutions, multilateral institutions, are significantly weakened by these two big powers and their rivalry in international politics. And since these institutions are becoming weaker and weaker, it will be much more difficult for humankind to confront and overcome the global common challenges like pandemics, or climate change, or cyber threat, etc., etc. So it is unfortunate. In that regard, I'm a little bit pessimistic. And in this kind of situation, it would be very desirable if the middle powers can unite with each other and make coalition and try to maintain a liberal order in international relations. I expect something like that would happen in the near future, but so far I couldn't see any serious efforts toward that direction. And I think, we are certainly in a kind of difficult situation, and there are some other things, two big powers, the United States and China, in order to stabilize international relations, probably.
So you have characterized this situation, the extensive competition and the tensions between the two superpowers, the United States and China, and also you are kind of regretful of the lack of the leadership in the global community and also the United States. And so I'd like to ask Professor Mearsheimer, will the upcoming election bring about the changes on the leadership of the United States in the world? And what do you see the most important different feature that we are going to get after the COVID-19?
A few words about COVID-19, and then I'll say a few words about the election. With regard to COVID-19, once it's over with, I think it will have zero effect on international relations. I think COVID-19 is obviously a huge problem for the world today. But once COVID-19 goes away, it's not going to have any effect on international politics. Just like the great influenza in 1918, once it went away, didn't matter. What really matters for the future, as almost every speaker has said, is the US-China competition. What's happened here is that we went from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And when the glacis plates move like that, international politics changes in profound ways. This set of rules, this liberal international order that was created after 1989 was basically created by the United States of America. The United States of America was Godzilla. The United States basically ran the world. And most countries, not all countries, but most countries were happy to let the United States run the world. But that world has gone away. And you now have in Asia a country called China that is interested in dominating Asia. It's interested in dominating the South China Sea. It's interested in dominating the East China Sea. It wants to take Taiwan back. It wants to change its borders with India in ways that suit China and not India. It's building a blue water navy to project power through the Indian Ocean into the Persian Gulf. It's forming close relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran. This makes perfect sense from Beijing's point of view. I don't blame the Chinese for 1 second. But from an American point of view, this is unacceptable. And the Americans are going to go to enormous lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. And the end result is that the institutions that now exist in the world are going to change in fundamental ways. Kishore likes to say that we created all these institutions in 1945, and he gives the impression that they were created for cooperation and to help the international community work more smoothly. Almost all those institutions that were created after 1945 were created to wage the Cold War. The United States was in a bitter competition with the Soviet Union from 1947 to 1989. We built institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, the European Union, and so forth and so on for the purposes of waging security competition. The United States and the Chinese are going to play hardball with each other. It's going to be incredibly dangerous. And it's going to be incredibly dangerous for Asian countries like South Korea. In the Cold War, most of the action was in Europe. It was not in Asia. That was to Korea's advantage. But this time, the competition is in East Asia. So I see lots of trouble coming, and it has nothing to do with COVID. It has, in my opinion, everything to do with the rise of China. And I still stand in amazement at all the people, especially in the United States, who believe that turning China into a super economic power was a smart thing to do. Indeed, it was one of the stupidest things American policymakers could have ever done. American policymakers have created a potential peer competitor. This is the height of stupidity. And we, the United States, and you are going to pay a price for it.
Okay, what about the election, Professor Mearsheimer?
Sorry. it's almost impossible to say who's going to win. I think that at this point in time, it looks like Joe Biden is going to win. But at this point in time in 2016, it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win. I think that most people agree that you never want to count Donald Trump out. He's very resourceful, and he has a huge base of people who support him completely, no matter what he does. So he could win. I don't think it matters very much who wins. And when I was in China in October of 2019 for 17 days and talked to all sorts of Chinese elites, my sense is they don't think it matters who wins either. I think the Chinese understand, much like I understand, that it's powerful structural forces that have doomed the Americans and the Chinese to compete. And whether Biden is driving the train or Trump is driving the train, there's going to be an intense security competition. So I don't think it matters very much for the U.S.-China competition. The only place where I think it matters is I think Trump has done a bad job of managing relations with countries like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, our East Asian allies. Trump tends to treat all countries with contempt. He slaps around our allies just like he slaps around our adversaries. And I think this is a huge mistake. I think that Trump has treated the South Koreans terribly, and it's a mistake. I think he's treated other countries in East Asia terribly. And I think if Biden gets elected, that he'll do a better job of working with the South Koreans, the Japanese, and so forth and so on. And that's all for the good. But in terms of the basic picture here, the question of whether there's going to be a security competition, an intense security competition between the United States and China, I think the die is cast there, and we're doomed to have an intense security competition, no matter who's in the White House.
Okay, so it doesn't really matter who is going to be in the White House, but it seems that from the alliance perspective, maybe the candidate Biden be better off for us, or I don't know, maybe we can interpret it in our own way.
That's my view.
Okay. So, President Paik, I think Professor Mearsheimer raised that point that it was inevitable. It was coming anyway, so COVID-19, or whether or not it was happening, the competition between the US and China is the real thing that we have to confront in the future. So what do you think?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kim. In my presentation, I said, regardless of the COVID-19 will be a game changer in international politics or not, we are living in an immensely changed world. And I shared with you the characteristics of COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 worlds, denuclearization, transformation, paradigm shift, and return of the geopolitics, return of the state and sovereignty, all of that. And I think, as you pointed out, and all our colleagues in this session pointed out, we have to, all kinds of, opinions and judgment on the fate of liberalism. I would agree with Professor John Mearsheimer in that when we move from unipolarity to bipolarity and multipolarity, sort of, and then the liberal international order is doomed to die, and not because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but because of the intensification of U.S.-China rivalry, not because of the trade war, but because of the science and high-tech competition and the ideological war between the two countries, as Minister Yoon, Young-kwan pointed out. Recently, United States, the White House published a U.S. strategic approach to the to People's Republic of China. In that strategy book, they replaced People's Republic of China by Communist of China, and Chinese Communist Party. And they repeatedly called President Xi Jinping the General Secretary of Chinese Communist Party in that book and in other speeches made by Mike Pompeo, at Nixon Library or somewhere in Czech Republic or Slovenia. And so this is an ideological war, system war, sort of. So this has a serious, implication for the future of, U.S.-Korea rivalry, and also on the fate of the liberal international order. And then, what has to be? What do we have to do? Have to respond to this intensification of the rivalry between the two big powers? Most recently, as we all witnessed, the United States and China pressured the allies and friends and the countries, in their thought, in the sphere of their influence, try to clearly take sides with either China or with the United States. Indo-Pacific strategy versus Road and Belt Initiative. And most recently, the Australia and the Singapore appear to take sides with the United States clearly, and then there is growing punishment from China to those two countries. And so I think as a country, for instance, South Korea, just in between, we have military alliance, more broadly, alliance cooperation with the United States, and economic partnership with China. So in the case of South Korea, I think it's very, very difficult to clearly make a choice between the two, because two countries are different, choices for us. One, military and security, and the other economy. So both are important for us. So it's not easy task, but we try to. I think we have to try to find a way to not to balance them, but try to harmonize the interest we have with both the United States and China, respectively. Thank you.
I have one question for you, though. Is the moment of truth coming anyway?
Again, you can say that, but a lot of people are talking about it. But policy is always a very calculated, a way of expressing intention and goal. So we can manage, in a way.
Okay, I believe so. I'd like to go on to the second theme of questions. Everybody's saying that we have to cooperate. Dr. Mahbubani, you have something to... Okay, Dr. Mahbubani, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I was very happy to hear John's comments on my remarks. So I thought I'd just briefly respond to his comments also. And as you can see, that even though we have different points of view, both of us are equally pessimistic about the US-China relationship being the dominant contest that will drive global geopolitics. Although, unlike him, I won't write off COVID-19 that easily. I think COVID-19 has been a searing experience for many countries, and I think it will have effect on our minds. But nonetheless, I agree with him that the main force will be the US-China geopolitical contest. I also agree with him that the United States has helped the return of China. The United States was very generous to China during the Cold War. Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing. The United States allowed China to the WTO. But I want to emphasize that even if the United States had not done that, China would have come back. And it's important to take the longer view of history, which is that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies were always those of China and India. And so the last 200 years of Western domination of world history, I keep emphasizing, has been an aberration. So in one form or another, China or India would have come back. And to be fair, they learned all the Western technology, Western best practices, and they have succeeded. And you cannot turn the clock backwards. You cannot push China back to where it was. That era is gone. China is now back. China is going to be the #1 economy in the world. And that's a reality we have to deal with. You know, whether you like it or don't like it, it's a reality. And John is a realist, so he understands that very well. You deal with the realities you have, the stack of cards you're dealt with, not what you wish for. But at the same time, I would say that, I agree with him that a US-China geopolitical contest is inevitable, but I hope that, you know, he's a great fan of George Kennan. I'm a great fan of George Kennan. And George Kennan always said that the outcome of the contest between the United States and Soviet Union would depend at the end of the day on which society is, and the words that George Kennan used was, which society has greater spiritual vitality. And I want to tell you all that the world wants to see a strong United States. We don't want to see a weak United States. A strong United States is good for the world. But then, if you want to get a strong United States, the United States has got to deal with its internal socio-economic problems. And the United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And if you look at the United States today, you look at all the rioting, the sea of despair that 2 Princeton University economists have spoken about, the United States should really focus on taking care of its internal issues and challenges. And that, I believe, should be the priority of the United States. And if the United States does that and bounces back stronger, it'll be very, very good for the world. And I want to emphasize this. So a United States that stops fighting wars in the Middle East, and I agree with John has written so eloquently, the United States has spent $5 trillion in post-9/11 wars. If he had taken the $5 trillion and given to the bottom 50% in America, each citizen in the bottom 50% in America would have got a check for $30,000 at a time when 60% of Americans don't have access to $500 emergency cash. So we would like to see a strong United States come back. Mm-hmm. But the final point I want to make is that John should make a distinction between institutions like NATO that were designed to combat the Soviet Union and institutions like the United Nations, which were universal, and everybody was a member, including the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and actually it facilitated cooperation. So even in the Cold War, there was collaboration between the Soviet Union and United States to prevent nuclear proliferation. And which agency did they use to prevent nuclear proliferation? Was the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which is part of the UN family. So the UN family has got universal institutions which cover all 7.8 billion people, cover all 193 countries, and these are the institutions that we can rebuild and strengthen and use to keep the world safe. So I hope that at the end of the day, let's not write off the 1945 rules-based order. It was a very generous gift from the United States and the West, and we in Asia should not destroy that order. We should strengthen it and build on it.
Yes, thank you, President Mahbubani. I think we can go on to the next question actually, because you raised the collaboration and also to emphasize the collaboration. Everybody is saying that in the rise of the COVID-19, the international community has to collaborate or cooperate with each other because it's something that we have to take care all together. But in the reality, that we observe the nationalism is rising. I mean, it may have been rising even before the coronavirus outbreak, but we observe the borders are shutting down, and the vaccine nationalism and the domestic politics is overwhelming the international politics. So my question is, can we ever expect cooperation in this situation? Well, it seems that a lot of politicians are putting the national interest ahead of the international cooperation, even though we all agree with that now is the time for the cooperation is most necessary. Well, I'll start with Minister Yoon.
I think, yes, cooperation will be possible if both the United States and China do something, which I will explain. It was an interesting exchange between Professor Mearsheimer and Dr. Mahbubani. And basically, I tend to be a little pessimistic about the future of international relations, but we do respect to Professor Mearsheimer's view. I'd like to be a little, just a little more optimistic than he is. What I'm saying is, I think institution may have some inertia even after a hegemon declines, or dominant power or unipolar power declines. For example, as Mr. Mahbubani already mentioned, IAEA has been working for a few decades despite some decline of American influence or something like that. Also, about 2 or 3 decades ago, there were heated debates about whether international cooperation would be possible after decline of American hegemonic power or something like that. So the institution may last and may be able to exercise its influence to some extent, despite some decline of hegemonic power. On the other hand, I'd like to think that individual political leader or the actor, for example, agent may matter in history, for example. Let's say this way: if the next president in the United States re-elected Donald Trump or newly elected Biden, that may not matter, but the new American president is willing to and capable of taking serious reform measures domestically in key fields like healthcare, tax reform, or education reforms, etc., etc. And in that way mitigate the pains and angers of those displeased, laid off workers or unemployed workers, and mitigate some political discontents of those people. And in that way, if he can mobilize domestic political support for continuing American role in restoring liberal international order, I think that will help a lot. That will help stabilizing international order very much. So I don't disregard, I don't lose hope for the role of political leadership. It is somewhat different point of view from Professor Mearsheimer, because he already mentioned that whoever may be elected in the next presidential election in the United States, that wouldn't matter. But if a new U.S. president, for example, give up, America First policy, as President, Trump pursued in the last 4 years, and try to engage China so that both countries can cooperate in meeting the global challenges together. And at the same time, if the new president tries to make coalition of like-minded countries or allies to pressure China to keep or respect liberal international rules, I think that will help a lot. And also, as Mr. Mahbubani already mentioned, I think the new US president may try to build a modus vivendi. In other words, how to coexist and co-work together to meet global challenges between the United States and China. That will help a lot, I think. And I mean, Mr. Mahbubani mentioned that China is back. Yes, China is back, but I think China is also, China also needs to behave carefully. In other words, what China needs most nowadays is Bismarckian prudence. As we all know, in the 1870s and in the 1880s, Otto von Bismarck, German Chancellor, tried very hard not to frighten its neighboring countries because he thought neighboring countries would be afraid of rising German power after unification in 1871. So his diplomacy was very careful and low-profiled and very ingenious. And he succeeded in preventing neighboring countries from making coalition against rising China, rising Germany. I need a Chinese leader, take into account that kind of historical historical experiences very carefully. For example, I think China might have departed Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide principle a little too early. And it made neighboring countries quite frightened. And according to Pew Research poll recently, about 79% of the people in the Asia Pacific thought that China's growing military is a bad thing for their countries. So I think China needs to behave carefully from now on. Also, for example, China tried to export so-called China model in recent years. And it frightened democratic countries in the world much. And as I already mentioned, it has stiffened bilateral confrontation very much. Chinese political leaders may try to export an authoritarian China model in order to prepare a much better international environment for continuing rule by Chinese Communist Party, but it may backfire in the long run, and it will lead to more and more confrontational international environment. So if both the United States and China can do these things, I think there will be some more room for mutual cooperation. That's my answer.
Okay, so it seems that that's nailing down to the cooperation between the United States and China first. So I'd like to turn the microphone to Professor Mearsheimer. So see, a lot of people are waiting for the U.S. back for the more responsible global leadership. So Minister Yoon raised that he still has some hope for the leadership of the U.S. president and come back to and take the global leadership as a responsible one. So what do you say about is there any possibility that the U.S. coming back to and take the global leadership?
Well, I understand global leadership and the desire for America to go back to being the global leader as another way of saying, let's bring back or resuscitate the liberal international order. The truth is, the foreign minister loved the liberal international order. The liberal international was wonderful. Liberal international order was wonderful for South Korea. You loved it. The Chinese loved the liberal international order. They got filthy rich as a result of the liberal international order. But the liberal international order is gone. It's all over with. because we're no longer in a unipolar world. When you're in a unipolar world where the United States does not have to worry about security competition because it's the only great power on the planet, it can then pursue very liberal and cooperative policies. And that's the world that you grew up in. And I fully understand why you love it. But the fact is that we no longer live in that world. And the United States now has to concentrate on China. And you talk about China behaving more carefully. China's not going to behave more carefully over time. China's going to grow more and more powerful over time. And as it grows more and more powerful, it's going to throw its weight around. That's the way great powers behave. You do not live in the Western Hemisphere, so you do not know what it's like to live next door to the United States. The United States is a ruthless great power. The United States has always been a ruthless great power. And China will be a ruthless great power because that's just the way great powers are. And for a country that lives right next door to China, like South Korea does, you should be extremely nervous. The idea of China turning into a behemoth that's more powerful than the United States would be terrible news for South Korea. I listened to you talk about the possibility of South Korea walking a fine line, not trying to get on China's side, not trying to get on America's side. You don't want to get too close to the United States because you may make the Chinese angry and vice versa. I'm telling you, when this security competition really heats up, and it's just beginning, this is just the start, you're going to have to choose sides. And really, the choice here is between security and prosperity, right? And I believe that you'll side with the United States because security is more important than prosperity. But we'll see what happens. And if the United States loses, and if all those problems that Kishore described really manifest themselves in even worse ways in the future, and the United States pulls out of East Asia, you're in real trouble. You're going to be living next door to a country that is not a status quo power. It's going to run Asia, especially East Asia, and it's going to tell you what to do. And you're not going to like it at all. And that's going to be true of every country in East Asia. So you better hope that the United States is there for you and that the United States acts smartly, more smartly than it's acted under Donald Trump. But I'm kind of a broken record here. This idea that we're going to live happily ever after is not the way this one works. Kishore is talking about George Kennan, and everybody talks about how George Kennan was the father of containment. What most people don't talk about is that George Kennan was also the father of rollback. In the late 1940s, he was interested in not simply containing the Soviet Union, but rolling it back. And if you look at what the United States is doing now with regard to technology in China, what we're trying to do to Huawei and other technological companies, this is not containment. This is rollback. We're trying to wreck high-tech industries inside of China. This is a harbinger of what is coming. And again, this is going to have very negative consequences for South Korea.
So from what you said, there's no room for the cooperation in the face of COVID-19.
Well, I didn't have a chance to answer that question. I have a full answer for that, but every time that question's asked, I'm the third person, and by the time you get to me, the question gets lost. Yeah, I'll say a few words about COVID-19 because I've thought long and hard about this. The argument is not that there's no room for cooperation to deal with COVID-19. The question you have to ask yourself is, what is the balance between cooperation and unilateral behavior? And the fact is that the President of the United States, President of South Korea, and so forth and so on, these leaders are responsible for their people. We live in a world of nation states. We live in a world of sovereign states. Kishore doesn't like this, but it's a fact of life, and nothing's going to change that. And in a world of sovereign states, leaders' first responsibility is to their people. Somebody was complaining about an America First policy. I want to ask you, what president of the United States would not have an America First policy? Do you think anybody could run for president of the United States and say, I don't put the interests of the United States above other countries? Of course not. Doesn't the South Korean president have a South Korea first policy? But what this tells you is that when you get into an extreme emergency, and that's what the COVID-19 crisis is, and it's an extreme emergency, the governing elites are going to take over, and they're going to go to enormous lengths to protect their people, first and foremost. And that's why you see so much unilateral behavior or nationalism around the world. But this is not to deny that you're also going to have cooperation. If somebody comes up with a vaccine, there'll be cooperation to spread that vaccine around. And there'll be cooperation with regard to research. So there'll always be some cooperation. Indeed, in the US-China competition, there will be cooperation. There will be trade. It's not going to be all competition. There'll be cooperation. But the question is, which is the key element in that relationship? Is it competition or is it cooperation? And with regard to dealing with COVID-19, this is an extreme emergency where national leaders are putting their country's interests first. And with regard to dealing with the Chinese, the Americans will put their interests first, the South Koreans will put their interests first, and the Chinese will put their interests first, because that's just the way international politics work. And in this case, it's going to lead to a lot more competition than it is going to lead to cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mahbubani is keep raising his hand, so I have to put the microphone his first, and then President Paik, please.
Thank you. You know, I find myself in a very strange situation where I agree with many of the premises that John is bringing to the table. And I agree with him that sovereignty is not going to go away soon. I mean, it should be eroded, but it's not going to go away soon. I agree that every American president will say America should be first. I also agree with him that the United States has been a ruthless great power, and China will also be ruthless in terms of defending its own interests. I accept all the premises, but strangely, I don't accept his conclusions. And the conclusion is this, you see, John, you're right, the United States was very ruthless in its neighborhood. And no, I mean, what it did in Central America, and even frankly ruthless in Middle East and so on and so forth. But I think if you could come and step into the shoes of East Asians, the first reality that any East Asian, or in fact any Asian country has to live with, and it's just a small point I say, that the United States will be around in Asia Pacific for another 100 years. China will be around for another 1,000 years. So China will be a neighbor of ours for the next 1,000, 2,000 years. And we have to deal with Chinese power. And realistically, it's very difficult for any neighbor of China to lock itself into hostility with China. And you know, John, the country that has got the most experience with China is Vietnam. I mean, Korea, I won't speak about, since Koreans know Korean-China relations better than I do. But Vietnam has lived with China for 2,000 years. Vietnam was occupied by China for 1,000 years. And any Vietnamese leader has to have two characteristics. First, he must be able to stand up to China, and he must be able to get along with China. If you cannot do both, you cannot be leader of Vietnam. And that's the challenge that all East Asian countries face. Now, the question is whether or not we can do both. And I believe both can be done. And here I want to emphasize, John, that China is not behaving like the former Soviet Union. China is not exporting its ideology. In fact, China stopped supporting communist parties in Southeast Asia after Lee Kuan Yew spoke to Deng Xiaoping and said, hey, you're going to support the communist parties to take my head off? How can I be your friend? So China stopped supporting communist parties. So China is no longer an aggressive exporter of communist ideology. So that's not the issue. But we have to deal with Chinese power. And the key word you used, John, which I completely agree with, is that you said that we're going to move into a multipolar world. Now, in a multipolar world, there are many powers, and the best thing the United States could do, and this is my one piece of advice, is listen to other countries who are saying, how do we get along with China and compete with China at the same time? And I would say the less we play a zero-sum game and try and find areas where we constrain China in some areas and collaborate with China in other areas. And the reason, by the way, reason why I like the 1945 rules-based order is that, as Bill Clinton said in a speech in Yale in 2003, he said, if the United States is going to be number one forever, then the United States can do whatever he wants to do. You're number one forever. But if you can imagine a world where the United States is the number two economy, then Bill Clinton says, it's in the interest of the United States to support multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral institutions that hopefully will constrain China. So the goal of all the neighbors of China is that we want to live with China, we have to live with China, but we also want to see China behave as responsibly as it can. And I like Bob Zelik's phrase of a responsible stakeholder. So if you're a neighbor of China, we understand very well how huge and how powerful China has become, but we have to learn to work with it. And if the United States could use a more subtle diplomacy, the United States will find there are lots and lots of friends in the neighborhood here who want to remain close to the United States, but want to be forced to choose between the United States and China. And I think a very smart US diplomacy could become very, very effective in this region. So I hope, John, you'll try and encourage diplomacy, encourage rules, encourage norms that at the end of the day will have an impact, I believe, in making sure that China doesn't behave as ruthlessly as it could behave.
Okay, well, thank you, President Mahbubani. Now it's your turn, President Paik. There's actually the question from the audience out there who is watching this live streaming discussion about the middle power role. He or she asked that what can the middle power country can do more specifically. And actually, there was a little bit thorny points like, what about Taiwan? Like a middle power like Taiwan, and can the country do something, when the Beijing is still in the very real playing an active role in the Taiwan Strait. And so I'd like to ask you to answer the big question, is there going to be the cooperation between US and China or all over the world dealing with COVID-19? And also what will be the specific roles the middle power country can do?
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Frankly, I was a little struck by Professor Mearsheimer's dichotomy between security and prosperity, particularly in giving us advice to Koreans. And I think, even when we talk about the security itself, we have been, gotten out of traditional, classical, security concept. We are talking about comprehensive security, even human security. And also, one of the points I emphatically made in my presentation was the very sorry fact that international community, particularly the United States and China, because of their big power mentality, are caught in the trap of interpreting and dealing with emerging non-traditional security issues in terms of traditional security thinking, and so I don't even make a dichotomy between non-traditional and traditional security issues. So that's something I want to emphasize again. Again, we are not. South Korea is not walking on a fine line, as I pointed out. We have economy, we have security. Both are important. If you talk about fungibility of sources of power, and then you can be afraid of our sort of, not balancing, but making partnership with China in economic area. But Korea is a U.S. ally, and we are very consciously, think of the importance of cooperation with the United States in the security area. And with regard to second question, the role of middle power in this situation. Again, I'm very sorry that we tend to be focusing on big power relations only, even in this new pandemic situation. So-called middle powers, if we look at the experiences of combating COVID-19 these days, Taiwan and South Korea, and Singapore and New Zealand, particularly in the South Korea. Let me focus on South Korea because I'm a Korean. It's a way of answering Taiwan's achievement in this area. These middle powers, for instance, South Korea is a country with manufacturing capability, and combine creative and problem-solving knowledge and ideas with innovative technological support. That's why we could, prevent, COVID-19 pandemic spread as much as possible as we see it these days. I don't think Korea disinfection could be a so-called K-disinfection could be a model of the world, but at least I think the government and the people all together, facing this huge, never experienced crisis like this, get together, bring together our energy and support, and fight this new crisis. So togetherness, we humanness, and this is very important in promoting our values like solidarity and cooperation, not only within the society but also across the nations for our benefit of the whole world, humankind. Thank you.
Well, thank you, President Paik. Another question, actually there are a lot of questions coming in, but it's very much focused on the relations between the US and China, maybe because it's the hottest issue, I think. And even there's a question even asking the South China Sea issue. I don't really think this is a subject that we can deal with in this session, but I'd like to go on to the question that President Paik, you said that there should be the togetherness and we have to have harmonize and cooperate. The all good words, but we observe that the populism is rising in a lot of countries, in the European countries, and I cannot really help not saying that there's the possibility this is rising in Asian countries as well. So in this kind of crisis time, populism always takes a lot of power, and people tend to go with the populism and right-wing politicians because they feel threatened. Do you think we can deal with it, and will it disappear?
What we see is a big disappointment in real politics. But as Minister Yoon pointed out, the importance of political leadership. Political leadership should be out front in bring in and mobilize all the energy and the resources we could in this in the fight of this COVID-19 crisis. And again, it's not easy for us to expect individual specific politicians in the United States and Korea and also everywhere around the world to come out with the satisfactory answers and attitude out of populism, but definitely it is a job of the political leadership to just to give people more accommodating and more inclusionary kind of answers to the question. And it's, again, easier, said than done, but that's political leadership's job.
Okay. Well, Dr. Mahbubani, China cannot be the exception. I think there's a huge rise of the populism within the China, and also, it's a COVID-19, and also there's some criticism from the United States and other world that they are behaving very defensively. But I don't really think China, I don't know, I mean, a lot of people say that China has been very responsible for what is happening and outbreak of COVID-19. I mean, some diplomats say that China is not responsible for this. And what do you think? What do you say? I mean, if the China wants to become the leader of the global community, should there be something different from what the China has been showing after COVID-19 outbreak?
Well, three quick points. One, there's no doubt that China made some mistakes in its management of COVID-19 in the beginning in Wuhan, and we know that. But by the way, also I talk to my medical experts friends. They always say when a new virus emerges, it's actually very, very difficult to control, to find out what it is, why it's killing people. There's a lot of confusion in the beginning, and that's quite normal. But nonetheless, there's no doubt that they made mistakes, but subsequently they collaborated with the rest of the world. But on the question of populism in China, I must say that, one of the wisest things that Graham Allison says in his book, Destined for War, which, like my book, has China One, is also about US-China relations. He says, he tells his American friends, be careful what you wish for when you wish for democracy in China. Because Graham Allison says that if you have democracy in China and you have democratic elections, you will get a far more nationalist leader. In fact, a leader as nationalist as Donald Trump emerging in China. And in that sense, actually, the Chinese Communist Party, paradoxically, is doing us a favor by bottling up Chinese nationalism. It could get far worse, far aggressive in a democratic setup. So I think the key issue here is the last point you mentioned about how we get along with China. And the reality is we are going to live with a China that is the number 2 economy in the world, will soon become the number 1 economy within 10 years or so, and then will become a massive new reality that we have to deal with in our doorstep. And that's why I actually believe that, for example, if you want to get China to collaborate on health issues, use the World Health Organization. And we should send a World Health Organization team to investigate what happened, what went wrong in Wuhan. And that's the right way to do it. But if we try to do it bilaterally, it'd be very difficult to change China. So it's a reality that we have to live with. And I think the more we can do to strengthen global, and I would say regional multilateral institutions. You haven't mentioned very much ASEAN, by the way, and I hope you'll pay some attention to ASEAN. But there are various ASEAN-based spun institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Summit, and there's something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. And of course, we hope that if President Biden, if Joe Biden is elected president, we hope United States will come back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So there are various regional and global institutions we can use to try and affect China. And I can say, as someone who spent 33 years in diplomacy, I do find that having more face-to-face meetings makes a big difference and can help to take away the edge in the differences. But of course, at the end of the day, power also matters. And this is the balance between diplomacy and hard power is what we have to manage in the next 10 to 20 years. And I want to say, and I agree with John here, it'll be very difficult.
Okay, well, Actually, coming on to that question, the WHO or multilateral institutions in the world, there's actually a question came in about the role of WHO because President Trump withdrew the membership and he is criticizing, and actually it's not just the United States, other countries also have a problem with the World Health Organization has been tilting toward China. So I'd like to ask a question to the, Professor Mearsheimer about the role of multilateral institutions and particularly WHO, and what about the criticism of WHO is taking side with China and the withdrawal of the US membership?
Well, a couple points. First of all, it's important to understand that President Trump hates international institutions. He's the only American policymaker I know who hates international institutions. He said NATO was obsolete. He pulled out of NAFTA. He made a foolish move pulling out of the TPP as soon as he became president. I agree with Kishore on that point completely. There's no way that the United States can maintain its position in the world without international institutions. We can argue about what kind of institutions you need, but President Trump's view that you don't need institutions is remarkably foolish. And a good part of America's attitude towards the WHO today has to do with President Trump's antipathy towards institutions. I think the WHO has some problems. I don't believe they're fundamental problems. And I think the United States should work to make the WHO more effective. I do believe, as I tried to make clear in my previous answer, that we do need cooperation to deal with COVID-19. There has to be some international cooperation, and the WHO helps on that front. So I'm in favor of the WHO. Now, with regard to the Chinese, here's what's happening. As China gets more and more powerful, it is becoming more influential inside existing institutions, and it is creating institutions of its own. Great powers create institutions, and great powers run institutions. That's the way the world works. South Korea is not going to create an institution. The United States is going to create an institution. Is this just? No, because there's no justice in international politics. It's power politics. And the United States has dominated the world's institutions, at least since the end of World War II. But what's happening is that there's this new kid on the block called China. And China is getting more and more powerful. And you read stories every day in the newspaper about how more and more Chinese are working in this institution or that institutions, or how Chinese leaders in this institution are becoming more numerous than they were in the past. This is exactly what we should expect. And by the way, what you're going to get in the future is you're going to get a number of Chinese-dominated institutions that exclude the United States, like Belt and Road, the Asian Economic Development Bank, and think about the TPP. What was the TPP? The TPP was an international institution that the Obama was creating that excluded China and was designed in good part to contain China in sophisticated ways. So you see these institutions that the great powers are developing to improve their situation in the world. And this is going to go on and on. In the end, what you're going to get in 20 or 30 years is a different constellation of institutions than we knew during the unipolar moment. Some of the names will be the same, but what happens inside those institutions will be very different. And just one final point on this, one of the biggest problems that the United Nations has, and I'm sure Kishore would agree with me on this, and I'm sure my two colleagues from South Korea would agree, is that it's based on a balance of power. The the Security Council is based on a balance of power that was that reflects what it looked like in 1945. So there's no Muslim country, there's no Turkey on the Security Council. India is not on the Security Council, and I could go on. And a lot of people argue that if the United Nations is going to be viable in the future, we're going to have to shift membership or increase membership on the Security Council. And what does this say? This says that the balance of power in the world, the global distribution of power, matters for who is sitting on the Security Council. And the existing system is outdated given the present balance of power.
Okay, the final question actually directed to Mr. Yoon. It came in from the audience out there, and he or she was asking about the cooperation. I mean, you said that there should be some cooperation in some areas, and what specifically would be the areas that possibly we can cooperate. I have to give you this question because I have to conclude this session more warmly and nicely as a chairperson. So what would be the areas that the global community can cooperate?
You mean mainly between the United States and China?
Between the United States and all over the world altogether as well.
As I already mentioned, I think the United States need to take a kind of two-track approach. One is try to build a coalition of like-minded countries to pressure China or persuade China to respect liberal international rules and order. On the other hand, the U.S. needs to engage, try to continue to engage China so that they can work together in meeting the challenges like global issues, like, for example, cyber threat or environmental issues, climate change, or pandemics. I mean, all these need common effort to solve the problem. And I think those global issue areas are the areas where the US and China and other international members should focus on, to work together. After all, I think in that way, despite some kind of pessimism on the future of international order, we need to be, relieved to some extent after watching the Cold War lasted almost half centuries without having hot war. So the US-China relations may be able to stabilize through efforts by wise and prudent leaders in both countries and international society. And that's why I'm emphasizing that both countries should try harder to build a modus vivendi. The Soviet Union and the United States at the time of Cold War confrontation, they coexisted and worked together to solve, some problems, global problems. But that means that they had some kind of modus vivendi. But now, since the confrontation between two big powers is relatively new, they have not yet established that kind of modus vivendi. The way to coexist and co-work together. So I think, the leaders from both countries may be able to focus more on that aspect from a medium-term perspective.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And well, I think it's about time to wrap up. And I think a very insightful and sometimes intensive discussion and debate. And I'd like to express my gratitude to all the panels who contributed to this very insightful and fruitful discussion. And please join me thanking to the panelists for their contribution with a warm applause. Okay. Okay, so I think we have to finish our first session. And thank you very much, everyone, and stay well. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 이상으로
Thank you very much. This is the end of session 1.
Session 1, and thank you very much for your intriguing debate with insightful ideas. It was indeed interesting and thought-provoking discussion, I should say. 열띤 토론 펼쳐주신 패널 여러분과 자장분께도 다시 한번 감사의 말씀 올리겠습니다. 내일은 한국 시간 오전 10시부터 두 번째 세션이 진행이 됩니다. 내일도 역시 많은 참여 부탁드리겠습니다. So this is the end of today's session, and tomorrow the second session will begin at 10 a.m. Korean time. Please, we hope to see you again tomorrow. Thank you.